Are you experienced? July 17, 1970. In the wake of Woodstock, the entire music business was gripped with what could best be described as festival fever. Multi-act shows, sometimes lasting a few hours, stretching out over days, were all the rage. This being the height of the Vietnam War, themes of brotherhood and peace typically were attached to the proceedings, to give the whole thing an air of nobility. Really, though, it was the music that mattered. That and the drugs. And the sex. The summer of 1969 had been a blast. I got into the hippie scene in a major way, drank a lot of wine, smoked a lot of pot, had sex with a half-dozen different girls. Everything was loose and easy and relatively safe. By the following summer, though, things seemed to have changed a bit. I noticed some of my friends had modified their habits when it came to dealing with mind-altering substances. Instead of just lighting up a joint, they'd drop some acid. A few had even started shooting dope. Heroin, frankly, scared the shit out of me. Always did. Even at the height of my drug use I stayed away from heroin, partly because I didn't like needles, but also because I honestly thought it might kill me. As for LSD, well, that was spooky shit as well. Probably had something to do with my bad glue trip and the scary psychosis that went along with it. I knew enough about acid to know that it could really fuck with your mind, and not just in the short term. I noticed that with some of my friends, if they had a couple of bad trips, the effects could linger for months, either in the form of flashbacks or depression. Then they'd start taking downers to ease the stress and anxiety that came with residual psychosis, or whatever you want to call it. All that mattered to me was this: if you dropped too much acid, and who the hell was to say how much was too much, you had a reasonable chance of ending up in the nothus. I didn't need that risk. My psychological state was fragile enough, as the U.S. Army had determined when I was classified 1Y following a psychiatric evaluation at Fort Hamilton, in Brooklyn. That got me out of the draft, which was all well and good, but it certainly left some lingering doubts about my mental health. So I never took LSD. Not intentionally, anyway. I may have been dosed a couple of times, however. I remember once in high school, for example, this kid named Alex who used to walk the hallways with a goofy smile on his face. A little heavy, with a bulbous nose and a face forever flushed red, he reminded me of Santa Claus. Handed out treats like St. Nick, as well. "Try this, man," he said one day, offering me a joint. "What is it?" "Panama Red." "Awesome shit." I smoked it that afternoon with my friend Keith, and we tripped in a major way. I'm talking day, glow colors and kaleidoscopic visions. I don't know for sure if it was laced with acid, but if not, it was the strongest, strangest pot I've ever smoked. I didn't like the effect, and had no desire to seek it out intentionally. I didn't want to lose control. Two guys in one of my bands, Neil and John, tripped regularly. Me. I preferred alcohol. That I could handle, or so I rationalized. I knew that I was going to have a career in music someday, and I wanted a better life for myself. I saw guys tripping on acid, incapacitated months down the road, and it didn't make sense to me. I didn't think it was worth taking something with the chance I could end up with permanent brain damage or incapacitating mental illness. The irony, of course, is that eventually I wound up with both, despite abstaining from heroin and acid. It wasn't worth rolling the dice when I wanted to accomplish bigger things. For better or worse, naively or not, that was my line in the sand. Instinctively, I realized I had to remain clear-eyed enough to take advantage of whatever opportunities came my way. There is a reason I chose the persona of the spaceman when I joined KISS. I believe wholeheartedly in cosmic intervention. Everything happens for a reason. I was 19 years old when I went to the New York Pop Festival. on Randall's Island in the East River, in the summer of 1970. This was yet another mini Woodstock, with an amazingly eclectic lineup of musicians that included Mountain, Steppenwolf, Jethro Tull, Grand Funk Railroad, Richie Havens, Sly and the Family Stone, Dr. John Van Morrison and Eric Clapton. Oh, and one other person. Jimi Hendrix. The whole thing was kind of surreal. You have to remember, for a kid like me, who used to walk around Roosevelt High with a copy of Are You Experienced? under his arm, seeing Hendrix was like a Catholic getting to meet the Pope. Hendrix was nothing short of godlike. By the summer of 1970, unfortunately, Hendrix was nearing not only the end of his career, but the end of his life. Within 2 months he'd be dead of a drug overdose. Still, on that day at Randall's Island, the last concert he'd ever perform in New York, he seemed at the peak of his powers, a living, breathing guitar hero. I went to the show with some friends I used to hang out with at Poe Park, a little spot in the Bronx where Edgar Allan Poe lived out his final years, and where the bohemian crowd around Fordham University used to gather. I once organized a concert for one of my bands there. But we separated shortly after we arrived. They were content to get high and listen to the music with the masses. I wanted to get closer. This had become a habit for me. Just as I'd managed to sidle up to Murray the K a few years earlier at the RKO Theater, I suddenly found myself inching toward the stage at Randall's Island. Maybe it was because I looked like a rock star, even if I wasn't one at the time. I was tall and skinny, with hair that went halfway down my back. I wore lemon yellow hot pants, a black shirt adorned with a snakeskin star, and checkered Vans sneakers. I fit in with the performers, more so than the crowd. As the day went on, I kept my eyes on the entrance at the side of the stage, and I started to notice that some of the guys who had performed were walking out and watching other bands. In those days things were pretty laid back. They didn't distribute official passes or laminates to the band members and road crew. If you belonged there, you just went about your business. Most people abided by the rules. Not me. I watched musicians walking in and out, offering nothing more than a nod or wave to security as they passed by. Then it dawned on me. Shit. I think I can get in there. So I walked up to the stage entrance, bold as hell, and looked one of the security guys right in the eye. He gave me a quick, visual once, over, head to toe, and nodded approvingly. I returned the gesture, didn't even smile, couldn't break character, after all, and walked on by. Just like that, there I was, backstage at the New York Pop Festival. Now I had a dilemma: watch the show from the best seat in the house, right next to the speakers, or hang out backstage and try to chat up my idols. A little of both, maybe. Next thing you know, I was sitting at a cafeteria table with John Kay, the lead singer, songwriter, and guitar player for Steppenwolf. We only talked for a few minutes, and it was cordial enough, but as John got up and walked away, he passed a security guard and pointed back at me. I couldn't quite hear him, but I could read his lips. Who is that fucking guy? Not wanting to attract attention to myself, I slipped out of the room, exited the backstage area, and took a more discreet position in a hallway between the stage and the dressing rooms. It was all very loose and informal, and let's be candid, a huge percentage of the people involved with the show, from performers to roadies, were high or stoned or tripping or drunk. I figured as long as I didn't cause any trouble, no one would bother to kick my ass out of there. This proved to be true. I fit in so well that after about 45 minutes of hanging out, somebody came over to me and said, "Hey, man, what band are you with?" I shrugged my shoulders, tried to play it cool. "I'm not with any band. I'm just hanging out." The dude smiled a half-baked, pot-headed smile. "You ever work as a roadie?" "A few times." This was true, if you considered setting up your own equipment to be roadie work. Cool, he said, gesturing for me to follow. Let's go. We walked down a hallway, through a curtain, and onto the stage, where I proceeded to set up drums for Mitch Mitchell, the vaunted drummer for the Jimi Hendrix Experience. I couldn't believe it. This was like a dream job, handling the equipment for one of the best drummers in the world, and doing it just a few feet from where Hendrix would be standing a short time later. I tried to maintain my composure, even as Hendrix's appearance drew near and the stage began to bustle with activity. I was working quietly with one of the band's real roadies, putting the kit together, when suddenly someone appeared at my side. A skinny white guy with a beard and a headband, he began tinkering with the kit, making subtle adjustments and occasionally tapping at the skins with his fingertips. I figured he was just another member of the crew, until I heard the other roadie say, "Hey, Mitch. Which snare you want to use tonight?" And then it dawned on me. Are you shitting me? I'm setting up Mitch Mitchell's drums, with Mitch Mitchell himself. How cool is that? You'd think a kid who worshipped all things Hendrix would have recognized the guy's drummer, but I knew Mitch mostly from album jackets and other photos, most of which had depicted him with a towering white man's afro. Apparently he'd opted for a style change shortly before the New York Pop Festival. I stopped everything and dropped the smooth facade. "Mr. Mitchell," I stammered. "Man, I love your music." He smiled, gave me a cool little nod, and put out his hand for me to shake. "Thank you," he said. And that was it. We finished putting together the kit, and the show went on. The entire time I felt like I was having an out-of-body experience. I mean, just 2 years earlier I'd gotten my first Hendrix album, played it till it warped. Now here I was, at the side of the stage, just a few feet from the man himself, having helped set up the equipment for his drummer. It was almost like I was part of the show. I was so starstruck that I could have died on the spot and gone to heaven happy. As the show went on, I totally lost track of time. I also lost track of the people with whom I had come to the show, a development that bothered me only at the end of the evening, when I realized I had no way to get home. At that time of night there was no public transport readily available from Randall's Island, and I didn't have the money for cab fare. So I walked out of the Downing Stadium parking lot and put my thumb in the air. The very first driver that went by hit his brakes and pulled over. "Where to, buddy?" "Mosholu Parkway, in the Bronx." The guy laughed. "I'm going to Bedford Park Boulevard." "Hop in." Amazing. Bedford Park Boulevard was about 5 blocks from my house. What were the odds? I opened the door, slid into the front seat, and let the warm summer breeze fill the car. "Guess it's your lucky night, huh?" the driver said as he pulled away from the curb. He didn't know the half of it. The craziest thing is, just 3 weeks later, August 6th, to be precise, I went to another massive, day-long concert with multiple acts, and again found my way backstage. This event was known as the Festival for Peace, at Shea Stadium. And just like at Randall's Island, they ended up putting me to work, juggling multiple duties. When Johnny Winter took the stage, I stood behind the band and fed sticks to his drummer. I was there, dumbstruck and wide-eyed, when Janis Joplin went strolling down the ramp to the stage, a half-empty bottle of Southern Comfort hooked between her thumb and forefinger. Like Hendrix, she would be dead of a drug overdose within a few short weeks. I got to hang out backstage and shoot the breeze with promoter extraordinaire Sid Bernstein, the man who brought the Beatles to America in 1964, for Christ's sake, essentially kicking off the British invasion and changing rock and roll, and, by extension, my life, forever. Best of all, I got to meet John Kay again. This time he didn't even say, "Who is that fucking guy?" It happened when I was backstage. One of the roadies asked if I knew anything about guitars. I didn't want to brag, but, yeah, I'd played a little bit. He handed me John Kay's guitar, a fresh pack of strings, and told me to get to work. There was something almost magical. Magical about that experience, prepping the instrument of a guy whose work I really admired. It brought me closer in some way to my dream of one day becoming the man on stage, as opposed to just another wannabe. While I carefully fed the strings, my attention focused entirely on the job, I heard a door open. In walked the man himself, John Kay. I tried to play it cool. You know, act like a professional. A part of me, okay, a big part, wanted to ask him if he remembered meeting me at Randall's Island, but that felt like such a pathetic fanboy thing to do that I decided to just keep my mouth shut. I figured the guy had probably met a million people since our paths crossed. What made me so special? Worse, as he watched me stringing the guitar, I got the sense that he was critiquing my work, and that at any moment I'd be revealed as a fraud and a fake. I half expected him to say, "What the fuck does this guy think he's doing?" But he didn't. Instead, Kay sat down next to me, introduced himself, and quietly picked up the package of guitar strings. "You want to take over?" I asked nervously. He shook his head. "No, that's okay. You're doing fine. Why don't you finish up?" Then you know what he did? John started feeding me strings. He would thread them through the bridge, and I would tie them off. We were partners, me and the founder of Steppenwolf, bound at least for a few short minutes by our love for the guitar, and our respect for how it worked, and the care it deserved. If you believed in the notion of a karma bank, and who didn't back then, this represented either a massive deposit or a massive withdrawal. Depended on your point of view, I guess. Not every concert experience ended so neatly, although a surprising number involved backstage banter with some of the biggest stars of that era. I don't know how I pulled it off, but I did. Repeatedly. The following summer, for example, I went to a Grateful Dead show at Gaelic Park in the northeast section of the Bronx, Riverdale. Situated on the north side of 240th Street, not far from Manhattan College, which later purchased and significantly upgraded the property, Gaelic Park wasn't exactly the bucolic setting its name might imply, but rather a collection of dusty athletic fields separated from the surrounding streets and elevated trains by a chain link fence topped with barbed wire. The place was used primarily by Irish neighborhood folks for soccer and hurling, as well as the occasional concert. Usually they were smaller, more intimate affairs involving Irish folk bands, but once in a while, especially in the early 70s, more ambitious ventures were undertaken. Like the Grateful Dead. This particular show occurred on August 26, 1971. It was my first Dead show and I certainly got into the spirit of things, drinking buckets of alcohol and smoking enough pot to qualify, at least for the day, as a Deadhead. No acid, though. As I said, I left that to the pros. Somehow, yes, I ended up backstage again. As usual, security was lax, and I just wandered around, looking and acting like I belonged. Soon enough an opening occurred and there I was, hanging out with Jerry Garcia. I know you're probably thinking that I'm stretching credibility at this point, but it all happened. Seriously. I have no reason to make this shit up. For a while there I was the zealot of the American rock scene, popping up randomly alongside the biggest stars in the business. I don't remember the exact details of my meeting with Jerry, instead I recall dreamlike bits and pieces of a trippy conversation. I can hear myself asking Jerry, "How's it going, man?" And I can see him standing there, smiling through that beard. "Good, man, good. We're taking it to the people tonight." I think I might have thrown a right on, brother back at him. Jerry was exactly as advertised, a laid laid-back hippie who seemed less like a rock star than a guy you'd see strumming his guitar outside a subway station, case open, bumming for quarters. He was a god at the time, but you'd never have known it by watching him. Even on stage he was content to just stand there and jam, his demeanor no different in front of 10,000 fans, or 100,000, than it was when he played in Bay Area coffee houses. You had to admire that about him. The guy was genuine. The weirdest thing about that day was not my meeting with Jerry, however, but the way it came to a close. At some point in the evening, after many hours of drinking, I passed out. When I woke it was 4 o'clock in the morning. I rolled over and looked across the Gaelic Park lawn, which had been utterly crammed with people just a few hours earlier. Now, though, it was almost empty. And by almost I mean I was the only person there. Not another soul. Just me, adrift in a sea of empty cans and bottles and paper cups, an assortment of garbage that gave the place a post-hurricane feel. Where the fuck did everyone go? I still have no idea what happened, why none of my friends roused me from my slumber, maybe they tried, or why the security guards left me there. They had to have known, right? They couldn't possibly have not noticed. Maybe they didn't care. Maybe this was the way things went down at a Grateful Dead concert. Regardless, I was on my own, locked inside the park. I shambled over to the main gate. Locked. I tried another gate. Also locked. Very quickly I came to the realization that I was either going to spend the rest of the night outdoors, sleeping on the lawn, or I was going to have to climb over the fence. Like a convict breaking out of jail, I scaled the chain link fence, pausing briefly near the top to catch my breath and to assess the likelihood of shredding my balls when I went over the barbed wire for the last few feet. I glanced back down at the park, at all the garbage and the empty bandstand. I knew what was involved in breaking down a stage after a concert, the noise and the barely controlled mayhem. I had slept through that. Unbelievable. I decided to go through the barbed wire, rather than over it, so that I could maintain my balance by hanging onto the chain link. A few careful moments later I was on the ground, walking home, my first and last Grateful Dead concert now officially in the books. Thanks to the generosity, or at least the tolerance, of my parents, I still lived at home during this time period. In fact, I didn't move out until after I joined KISS. We'd stopped fighting by this point about what I was going to do with my life. I'd appeased them somewhat by going back to school, and I think they figured I was probably safer under their roof than bouncing from place to place, bumming off my friends. I wasn't home all that often anyway, and when I did come home, it would be late. I pretty much used the house as a crash pad. There wasn't much dialogue going on between us. They were getting older and had less energy to deal with the disparities in our lifestyles. I'd throw them money once in a while to help with rent, which made things better, and at least the cops weren't bringing me home at night. It could have been worse, and Mom and Dad knew it. Basically I just tried to keep the peace. Any insanity, or at least most of the insanity, I tried to keep outside the house. All of my energy went into playing music. I was in multiple bands at any given time, juggling gigs, rehearsals, sometimes playing 2 different venues in a single night. I did whatever I had to do to make some cash and hone my craft. If that meant throwing on a tux and playing a wedding or bar mitzvah, then that's what I did. If it meant driving up to Kutcher's or one of the other resorts in the Catskill Mountains and playing for families on vacation, then I did that. There was dignity in all of it. Sometimes there was fun to be had, too. The Catskill gigs represented my first taste of the road life, and I didn't find it unappealing. The Jewish girls up there loved us, and we loved them, although I'm not sure how their parents would have felt, had they known what went on after hours. We'd go up for a few days or a week, serve as the house band, get free room and meals, and a small stipend for our efforts. Not bad at all. It was like a free vacation with girls and alcohol and great food. All we had to do was play a couple of sets per night. That could get a little tricky, blending material that wouldn't offend parents with the stuff we really wanted to play. But the same was true when you played weddings. I always managed to sprinkle in an assortment of songs that I liked, a cross-section of popular music from Creedence Clearwater Revival, The Beatles, and Stones, along with more album-oriented rock from Led Zeppelin, Cream, Grand Funk Railroad, and Hendrix. Mostly songs you'd hear on the jukebox, punctuated with edgier, harder stuff. Once in a while the resort manager would give me a hard time, but I was always able to talk my way through it. The thing is, there was no way I could get up on stage and not play at least some of the music I really loved. I knew too much about the music scene about what really mattered to play nothing but top 40 covers. Shit, I was at the Fillmore East in 1969 when Zeppelin made its first New York appearance. Incredible though it might seem now, they opened for Iron Butterfly that night, and absolutely blew the headliners off the stage. I can still see half the crowd walking out, disillusioned, midway through Iron Butterfly's set. No reason I couldn't play a whole lot of Love for the Folks at Kutcher's, they'd get over it. The most professional and polished, and overtly ambitious, of the bands with which I played in those days was undoubtedly Molimo. The name of the band, as I understood it, though I've never verified, was taken from a Portuguese word that could loosely be translated to mean music of the forest. I also recall one of the guys in the band saying the name was an African word for an instrument used during sacred tribal initiation ceremonies. So who knows? Either way, totally 60s, right? I didn't know what to expect the first time I showed up to rehearse with these cats at their loft on Canal Street in Lower Manhattan. Conceptually speaking, Molimo was an odd little hippie band that modeled itself after Jefferson Airplane. We had two lead singers, one male, Tom Ellis, one female, Christine Murphy, who alternated at the microphone. It was totally out of character for me, unlike anything I'd ever done before. And to be honest, it didn't interest me much. But they'd written some good songs, and as a result had landed solid management and a speculative recording deal with RCA Records. I remember how exciting it was the first time we went into the RCA building in Midtown to put together our demo, walking into the very same studio where Frank Sinatra had recorded. If you care about music, that kind of history is palpable, you can feel it the moment you enter the room. I was 20 years old and trying to become a professional musician. Working with Molimo was as close as I'd ever been. We played a few shows, including one at the Fillmore East, and it seemed then that we were right on the cusp of hitting the big time, until RCA pulled the plug, midway through the recording of our first album. For me, though, it was a mercenary pursuit. I got involved with Molimo not so much because I fell in love with their music, but because I saw it as an avenue to become more deeply involved with the music business, particularly the recording end of it. I considered it a gig, not a passion. Simply put, I did it for the bread, and that's about it. You do what you have to do to make ends meet. I liked the people in the band, though a diverse bunch that included not just male and female singers, but a New York City cop who was moonlighting as a keyboard player. He used to comb his hair straight back when he went to work and tuck it up under his cap. When he'd show up to play with Molimo, he'd comb it forward and let it hang down over his collar. I also became friendly with the drummer, Dave Polinsky, and the bass player, Barry Dempsey. In fact, at the same time that we were working in Molimo, we formed a power trio designed to fulfill our hard rock desires and to put some extra money in our pockets. The name of that little group? The Muff Divers. I shit you not. Obviously, with a name like the Muff Divers, and I forget which one of us came up with the name, or why we thought it was appropriate, although you can probably guess, we weren't particularly concerned with commercial success or the likelihood of securing a record contract. The Muff Divers just wanted to play hard, fast rock and roll. Molimo played only original material, so it was limited in scope. I'd been in top 40 cover bands before, playing songs people recognized, and so had Dave and Barry. So when Molimo wasn't working as much and we all needed extra bread, we went out as the Muff Divers. Any chance to play was alright by me. The name of the band? The venue? The size of the crowd or even the size of the paycheck? All irrelevant. I tried to treat every performance in every dive club as if I were headlining Madison Square Garden. Arrogance was not part of my makeup. If anything, I was insecure. I never considered any gig to be beneath me. If someone wanted to pay me, even if it was just a few bucks, and people were willing to listen, even if their numbers barely reached double digits, then I was more than happy to give them my best effort. Some nights, naturally, were more memorable than others, though not necessarily because of anything that happened on stage. There were the occasional bar fights, for example. They're unavoidable when you're playing in shitholes, with loud, drunken customers challenging you for the crowd's attention. Usually they ended benignly, with barely a punch being thrown. Once in a while, though, the band was equally loaded, and when that happened it didn't take much to provoke a violent disagreement. There was the time in Paterson, New Jersey, when I was invited to sit in with Tommy Doyle's band because they were short a guitar player for the night. I expected a typical Jersey bar, filled with guys in T-shirts and jeans, smoking and hanging out with their girlfriends, tossing back bottles of Rolling Rock. Instead I stumbled into a place that looked more like a mob lounge, very laid back and moody, with guys in suits accompanied by ladies who probably were not their wives. It was most definitely not a rock and roll venue, but I didn't care. I started drinking early and hard, and kept right on pounding through the night. With each successive beer my guitar playing became, if not necessarily sharper, definitely louder. Much louder. It's probably fair to say that I failed to exercise the appropriate level of respect or restraint, given the nature of the clientele and ownership. When the owner approached me during a break and complained about the volume, I blew him off. By the end of the night he'd had enough. And I'd had 1, or 10, too many. As we broke down the stage and packed away our instruments, I asked Tommy if we'd been paid. He explained that the band had in fact been paid its fee, but that the owner had originally promised a little something extra for me, since I filled in on short notice. That way Tom wouldn't have to pay me out of pocket, and the other guys wouldn't feel shortchanged. So I found the owner, who was working behind the bar, and asked him, rather impolitely, I'm sure, for my money. Fuck off, asshole. You already got paid. That was probably the least hostile thing either of us said in a profane exchange that lasted roughly 5 minutes, and ended with the owner reaching over the bar and leveling me with the right hand so solid that at first I thought he'd cracked a beer bottle against the side of my skull. But he hadn't. The guy had simply used his fist to shut up a drunken guitar player, and he'd done it effectively. The next thing I knew, the guys in the band were carrying me across the parking lot and stuffing me into the back of a van. They drove me back to the Bronx, brought me upstairs to my room, and put me to bed. I woke the next morning feeling like utter shit. My face was swollen and bruised, and my right eye was so red that it looked as though blood was leaking into the socket. Coupled with the natural awfulness of a 12-pack hangover, these symptoms left me feeling like I was on the brink of death. But it was when my mother saw me that I realized just how bad it must have been. Oh, my God, she screamed, putting both hands over her mouth. You need to get to a hospital. When your mother doesn't even ask for an explanation, but simply tells you to get medical help immediately, you know you're in trouble. So I went to see our family doctor, who immediately ordered an X-ray. The diagnosis, a shattered cheekbone. The whole thing is crushed, he explained. You need plastic surgery or you're going to have problems with breathing and eating for the rest of your life. He paused. Not to mention, you'll look like shit. Our family didn't have a lot of money or fancy insurance, or anything like that, which made the prospect of reconstructive surgery daunting, to say the least. Luckily we had an ally in our family doctor. This guy had been treating me literally since the day I was born. He delivered me. He was an old-time family doctor who wanted quality care for his patients, regardless of their financial state, and sometimes he intervened on their behalf to make sure things worked out. "Let me make a call," he said. "I'll see what can I do." He did plenty, arranging for the services of a Park Avenue plastic surgeon named Dr. Lane, with whom he had gone to medical school. This guy was top-notch, one of the best reconstructive facial surgeons in the city. His specialized in putting people back together, people who had been battered in automobile accidents or victimized by violent crime. The doc took my case for practically nothing. I can still vividly recall the consultation, during which he told me not only that I didn't have to worry about the money, but that I was fortunate to be alive. "You came within a 1/16 of an inch of puncturing your brain when the cheekbone shattered," he explained. "If that happened, you wouldn't be here right now." Dr. Lane's plan was to wire my cheek back together. It was a complicated, tedious procedure, and one with significant potential for error, which scared the shit out of my family. The night before the surgery, my Aunt Ida, who was something of a religious fanatic, born again in her mid-40s, and a holy roller from that point on, and who was prone to praying on my behalf anyway, which I doubtless needed, encouraged the entire congregation at her church to keep me in their prayers. I don't think my mother slept a wink that night. I'm sure Dad was nervous, too. When they put me under, I had no idea how things were going to turn out. When I woke in the recovery room, Doc Lane was standing over me, smiling. "You won't believe what happened." I mumbled something incoherent in response. My head felt almost as bad as the morning after the bar fight. "I didn't have to wire a thing," he said. He paused and shook his head. Later, when the anesthesia had worn off, he would tell me in greater detail exactly what had happened, comparing my mutilated cheekbone to the shell of a hard-boiled egg. It had been caved in and cracked in multiple places, but had somehow held together. With a gentle push, the cheekbone popped back into place, without so much as a fragment splintering off. "That rarely happens," the doc said incredulously. "You're a very fortunate man."